Hello YouTube Vintage Stereo Restorers. Today I want to talk about kind of the evolution of bench teching, buying parts for these vintage stereos. So I started in vintage stereos as a bench tech over 40 years ago. And I was kind of a little later to the game than some others. The tech I worked with had been doing it since 1969 and had this guy was like an encyclopedia of knowledge. And I really, we had two ways of doing things back then, okay? We did warranty service for Kenwood, Yamaha, Sensui, NAD Techniques. We had Sony car stereo, but not Sony home stereo. And warranty work was basically so often blown outputs. People drove their units hard, drove them loud. There's a lot of heavy metal back then. A lot of the young guys buying stuff and pushing it to the max. And many times I would see strands of speaker wire between the plus and minus shorting the output but not blowing the protection fuse or the circuit. Very often. Anyway, units that were under warranty we replaced because we were dealing in a system, it was a dealer system with a distributor. We got paid for the warranty work. We had to get the parts from them, and they were always like they were OEM parts. It was the same transistors, same like identical parts most of the time, unless there was a substitute or a back order. And we got paid a rate, 0.6 hours to put in a set of outputs, 0.4, to do a controlled cleaning, number of things like that. And it kept the store going during hard times when sales weren't that good. Then the second part of the repair business was stuff like this that would have been, like in my case, about 10 or so years old when I got into the business. And people would bring them in, and they would have paid a fair buck for this stuff, and people didn't like to throw things out. There was more fixing of things. Any of you old timers like me know what I'm talking about. And they'd say, well, I want, it's got a dead channel, it has this problem, it has that problem, whatever. And so we did parts and labor. So it's say, well, it's going to be about 2 hours, and I think we were charging it was $19.99 an hour or something like that. And the parts we got them from a distributor, and there's several small electronic supply shops in town, and they would have usually it would be a few different brands, but they were substitutions. So you'd say, I need a couple thousand microfarad capacitors, they're 30 volt, and they'd say, well, we've got a can that fits, but it's 50 volt, and it would be a different brand. You'd say, I've got a germanium transistor, a 2SB89A, it's blown. What do you got? And they might have something from 20 years ago in their inventory that they would sell to you. Or they would say, well, here's a generic PNP transistor, but it's silicon. You're going to have to adjust the bias voltage. It will work. I'm like, oh, okay. So the work that wasn't warranty, we're already into basically what we're doing today, and that's finding the best parts to substitute or improve on what was originally there. And the same thing like the example of transistors in here. Oh, these little C458s that commonly go noisy. Well, there's quite a few. I've already taken 2 out. There's 6 here and another one there. It would be just like, oh, well, give me a generic NPN transistor, and it was almost always a 2N3904, and which is the case today. I found that 3904s, 3906s, 2222s, those type of transistors would cover many applications, and they're usually of a better, because they were newer, they had better manufacturing tolerances, less likely to go noisy, also very reasonably priced. And so that's what I basically do. I don't try to get a OEM C458, or I use something like a 3904, or there's some other ones if you're using those BC part numbers. Anyway, basically what I have is signal transistors. So for the vintage stuff that doesn't have ICs, I have 2222s, and then the metal can variety 2219s, and then PNPs, these 2905As. Those will cover a lot of driver transistors. And then of course, I don't have them here, but if you have driver transistors in larger output units that have a TO3 output, but it's the driver, anything that's a heat sink driver, you can usually use a Texas Instruments transistor like a tip 31B or a tip 32B, something like that. Higher current handling, higher voltage. And the way these circuits are biased, there's quite a bit of leeway. And so when you're buying transistors, many times you're just not going to match the originals. Like, how are you going to find a 2SC984? Well, you're going to use one of these 2219s. And then let's say, for instance, diodes, very similar thing. An FR1, I have one of these is open. It was affecting the bias setting and the thermistor wasn't working on this channel. You can use an IN4001. That's the direct substitution. But I buy IN4007 diodes. I buy 100 pack of them. And so you can use them in the power supply rail. You can use them as bias diodes or anywhere that you're handling power. They work really well, and you don't across many brands and quite a few years you can use them. I used them in a 1967 Electron TV set. And then the same with capacitors, like these old oil ones, 0.022 630 volts. I buy the polyester ones in 600 volt. I use those. And like here's a diode right here with a snubber on it. This is a silicon diode, but it's replaced with an IN4007. The reason I cut them out of there, the oil cap has lost its effectiveness. Right there you can see I have some orange dips. Same with things like the bias pots. You can now get the sealed ones that are multi-turn. They work really great. Widely available at places like Mauser, Sale, those warehouse type places. And then here's an excellent substitution right here. Originally a 30 volt 1000 microfarad. It's now, in order to fit the clamp, it's a 200 volt 1200 microfarad. Nothing wrong with that, but if you want a clamp style, and I have to admit they look great, you can use that. So that's kind of how you have to look at parts now. You can't always get what you want. You can get something better many times. Now, as you get into newer stuff into the 80s with integrated circuits, and you get these Darlington pair amps or SDK amps, much more critical. The resistor values, the rail voltages, and you've got to trying to find parts. And I had one just very recently, a Pioneer, nice little receiver from 1984, but it had an SDK pack with a dead left channel, and I bought it, and it was the basic, very reasonable, but it was both channels working, tested, etc. And I get it, and it's like dead channel, obviously been dead for a while. I could not manage to actually find an SDK at a reasonable price. There's some companies that are building circuit boards that you can use in that place, but to get it here would have been about 90 bucks. It just wasn't worth it, so now it's a parts unit. So that's just another example. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. And thanks for watching and listening.